And the same thing can really be said about the modern evangelical movement. It's kind of a mix between the fundamentalists and the neo-orthodox. And so there ends up being this purple shades in between it. And that ends up becoming really important. He explains here, and this is something that, anyone who's done, sociological research already knows about this, so this will be kind of boring. But if you don't, there's going to be surprising things here. Evangelical means a particular thing. And this is how it's usually talked about in the media. And it's not even that helpful, except for the fact that this is how a lot of people think about it. Really, what they do is they divide the church into the mainline and the evangelical, but they're only talking about white people there. If you're not white, you're put into a different category, which is the black church. And if you're not Protestant, you're put into a different category, for example, the Catholic Church. And so whites end up being, by definition, evangelical. Evangelical ends up being, by definition, white and Protestant. And that's really confusing. And there's several ways to kind of think about how someone gets sorted into evangelical versus mainline if you're white. But really, it's a messy categorization, but the right way to think about it is probably more theologically conservative on the evangelical side and theologically liberal on the mainline side. That's really what's going on here. And to kind of reframe Melissa Childer's argument into this framework, what she's really saying is that she sees a lot of dangers in the mainline side of the church. And look, and because of things that she would say are theologically heterodox or even heretical at times. And I would say that that's actually probably true in important ways, but there's got to be a lot of nuance in how we talk about that. So one of the most helpful ways I've had to think about this is from Mark Knoll's work. And if you can go to the next slide. So this is another book I highly, highly recommend. I kind of have some stray arrows there to the left. Sorry about that. But it's called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll. He was a Wheaton historian, and he really is telling the story of evangelicalism from really the American side of it, which is much more our context right now, not that there isn't Europeans listening in, but this is a core part of it. So what he really frames this as, and I think this is really correct, one of the most important debates that goes back, about 150 years is the modernist fundamentalist debate. And fundamentalist here means something very different than what we mean by it now. Right now, fundamentalists, we kind of mean as like the hyper-conservative wing of evangelicalism, maybe. But fundamentalist back then was a far broader thing, okay? And there was the modernists. Modernists were a group of Christians. They still called themselves Christians, but there's a big cluster of things. They tended to be more educated. They really came to value social action and justice. They were also anti-miracle to the point of actually rejecting the resurrection and the virgin birth. And also they would affirm evolution. All these things got really bundled together into a tight package. On the other hand, you have the fundamentalists. They really affirmed the resurrection and the historical creeds, and they took a more populist approach to it. But with that, they threw out the baby with the bathwater at times. I mean, most people here know that I really affirm evolution. I think there's really good science for it. And there's nothing in evolution that entails that we reject the historical creeds. But because things got clustered that way, a lot of fundamentalists end up taking pretty extreme positions against everything associated with the modernists, all right? And so that's really kind of the history. I mean, it goes through the Scopes trial. It's really one of those things that's really just difficult. Now, neo-orthodoxy, which really starts out as a primarily European thing, it's people like Karl Barth. And to be clear, most of us would have very positive things to say about Karl Barth. I mean, he has some issues and how he treated women. He certainly, says some things that we're going to raise eyebrows at. But one of the things that's really important about neo-orthodoxy is that they were kind of in this modernist context, but then said, hey, wait a minute, Jesus really rose from the dead. And there's something important about historical Christianity. And so in a lot of ways, they're kind of like a reaction against modernism. They really inherit quite a bit from modernism, but they're reacting against it in probably some of the most important ways of kind of really reclaiming historical Christianity from within that modernist context. And really, when you kind of think about our current moment of like with mainline versus progressive versus evangelical, in a lot of ways, the mainline movement is kind of this mix between the modernists, and the neo-orthodox. And the same thing can really be said about the modern evangelical movement. It's kind of a mix between the fundamentalists and the neo-orthodox. And so there ends up being this kind of this purple shades in between it. And that ends up becoming really important, because, much of what Alyssa's saying would be entirely true of the modernists. But current progressive Christianity is a bit more complicated. Because they've had some revisions and some movement back towards that, at least in many aspects of it. And the same can be actually true of evangelicals. And before you take too negative a view of modernists, a lot of the fundamentalists were segregationists. And part of the reason why they were opposing social action and social justice, because they were really going in some extreme ways towards, on racial justice, and saying even it's a matter of inerrancy that we really uphold segregation. That might seem really foreign to us, but you only have to go back. You don't have to go back that far at all to see really clear evidence of this. We could talk about Bob Jones University and what's happening there. And I think what's particularly interesting and important, it's really out of that conflict that what we really understand as evangelicalism really forms.